Interested in learning about wine, but not sure where to start? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I'm your host, Haley Bowman, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a wine enthusiast turned wine educator and founder of the Seattle-based wine tasting business, Cork and Fizz. It is my goal to build your confidence in wine by making it approachable and lots of fun. You can expect to learn everything from how to describe your favorite wine to what to pair with dinner tonight, and so much more. Whether you're a casual wine sipper or a total cork dork like myself, this podcast is for you. So grab yourself a glass and let's dive in. Wow, I cannot believe this is happening. It's finally happening. My first podcast. And I thought for a while what the first episode should be. And I realized I might as well start with the most important thing I can teach you. And that is my 4-step wine tasting method. This is the same method that I teach in all of my private tasting experiences, and also the same method that we follow in my virtual tasting club, the Cork Crew, when we're trying all of our new wines. It's a proven 4-step process, and once you know this process, you'll be able to explore new wines, and it'll build your confidence in wine. Trust me, I've had people start out in my Cork Crew who were just drinking, white wines, and all they could taste in the wine, was just wine. And now, following this process, they are listing things off no problem, trying new things, walking into wine shops and asking for different wines. Trust me, this is what you need. And it doesn't matter if you've never tasted wine before, if you've never done this process before, you can learn this technique. If you can tell the difference between, a cheddar chip and a barbecue chip, you can taste things in wine. And I'm going to go through it step by step so it's not overwhelming. It's going to be a lot of fun. Now, of course, since we're going to be going through this 4-step process, I highly suggest grabbing a glass of wine and following along. Of course, if now is not the right time, if you're driving, if you're going for a walk, totally understand. You can still learn just by listening. Then be sure to check out my show notes on my website or re-listen for a quick reminder once you have a glass of wine handy. And one last note before we get into it, if you're more of a visual learner or you'd like something to follow along with, you can head to my website, corkandfizz.com/wine tasting guide, and you can download my free wine tasting guide, which has a nice visual version of these 4 steps that I'm going to walk you through. All right, let's get into it. So this 4-step process, it's very simple. You're going to look at your wine, smell the wine, taste your wine, and think about your wine. This last step is often missed, but is the most important step in all of it. But let's start from the beginning. So first, you're going to look at your wine. Now, when you're looking at your wine, I know you're going to be tempted to hold that glass up and to look at it in the light. But actually what I want you to do, I want you to hold it out in front of you. You're going to look down through the glass and you're going to hold it at about a 45-degree angle with the bowl, so the opening of the wine glass, facing away from you. All right. So you're going to look down and you're going to see kind of this circle that the wine creates, and it's going to have some sort of color to it. The other important thing here is that you have something white underneath it. So it can be a white sheet of paper, if your table is white, if you have a paper plate, a napkin, anything. You're just going to want to put white underneath it so that the only color you're seeing is the color of the wine. Now, while you're looking at the wine, what you're going to do is you're going to look for the hue, fancy word for color, and you're going to look at the depth. What is the intensity of that color? Now, if you have white wine in your glass, the colors we like to use, or at least the colors I generally use, it's going to be straw if that wine has a little bit of like a greenish tint going on. It's going to be yellow if it's just pure yellow. And then it's going to be gold if you're seeing something a little darker, maybe a little hint of brown going on in there. So for, again, white wine, your options are straw, yellow, and gold. And you're really looking for that undertone, because I understand most white wines look like white wine. It's hard to tell the difference. This can also be easier to tell the difference in color when you have a couple of them poured out. So I'm not saying you have to, but it is a good excuse to pour a couple white wines so you can see the difference in color. All right, now if you happen to have a red wine out, we're going to have some different colors that we see. So with that one, it's going to be ruby if it's just a pure red showing through. It's going to be garnet if you have a little bit more, brown undertone showing. And then finally, it's going to be purple if, you guessed it, there's a little bit of purple or blue showing in that wine. And again, these can be hard to see. They're very similar in color. So some of the best ways to see this is to have an array of different wines to kind of compare and contrast. So that's looking for the color. Now the question is the intensity of that color. Basically, how much of it are you seeing, right? And so when we think about our white wine, a pale intensity, a pale depth of color, that would be something where your wine almost looks watery. Like you're not totally convinced there's wine in the glass. Okay. And then from there, we go to medium and then to deep color. It's just, you're still always going to be able to see through a white wine, right? It's never going to be opaque, but it's just so dark in color and it's really intriguing. That would be your deep color. Now, when it comes to red, it's a little easier to tell the depth because if it's a deep red, you are not going to be able to see anything through that glass. So a lot of times I like to hold up my glass to a sheet of paper with some writing on it. And if I can see anything through my red wine, that means it's not deep, right? It's either pale or medium. So color, there's a couple different things that we can tell from color. It does give us a hint to the variety. There are certain grape varieties that have a certain color to them. For example, Malbec is always going to have this magenta purple hint to it or tint on the outside. That's a good way to know that there's a good chance you have Malbec in your glass if you're seeing that magenta. The other thing that color can tell us is the age of the wine. And this is really cool. As wines get older, their color changes. And this is because the oxygen in the air is interacting with the wine and it oxidizes it. Kind of like how if you left an apple out, right? You take a bite. If you left that apple out, the apple starts to turn brown. That's that oxidation. When it comes to wine, as a white wine gets older, it gets darker. It starts to get towards this, amber brown color. Red wine, as it ages, gets lighter and also goes towards this amber brown color. I haven't had a wine, or at least a white wine that old yet, but I have seen one that somebody shared. It was a Riesling, probably 30 years old, and it looked brown, but it tasted great. Isn't that crazy? Well, she said it tasted great. I'm gonna believe her on that. So it's really cool. So if your wine is very, your white wine is very light in color, there's not a whole lot of intensity to it, there's a good chance it's young. And then same thing on the red side, if you're seeing a lot of bright, just pigmented color, that's going to be a younger wine versus something that's starting to show that brownish color on either end. So in the white wine, if it's getting darker, and the red wine, if it's getting lighter and it's going towards that amber, that's telling you age. Last thing I'm going to say about looking at the wine, a common question that I get is, what about the legs? Also called the tears. So if you're like, what legs? What are we talking about? This is when you either swirl your wine or when you take a sip, and then as the wine is traveling back down the glass, you can see on the outside how it's traveling. And those little drips of wine, a lot of people call those the legs or the tears in the wine. And it used to be said that those were a sign of quality, that if a wine had good legs, it was a good quality wine. That is not true. we have busted that myth. That is not true. Those legs are a sign of two different things. So they can tell you the alcohol level and they can possibly tell you the sweetness level. So essentially, the slower those legs move, it's likely that you have more alcohol in that wine. And there's a scientific principle behind it. I am no chemist, so I'm not going to explain that. But it's basically the idea that alcohol makes your wine a little more viscous, a little bit heavier, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's going to make the wine move slower. It's like if you had a thicker liquid, it's always going to move a little bit slower. And then if the legs move more in sheets than in like single tiers, that might tell you that there's a little bit more sweetness in that wine. And same thing, there's a whole chemistry behind it, but you're not going to get that here. We're just talking wine. Okay, that was our first step. So we've looked at our wine, we've determined the color and the intensity. Now it's time to smell the wine. Now, before you get too freaked out, I recognize that this is hard, and that's okay. It's hard for everybody. But let's keep a couple things in mind. One, smell is the sense that's most tied with memory. So if you take a smell of the wine and you're instantly brought back to something, but you can't put a name to it, that is very common. So a couple smells for me that immediately take me back. So for the longest time, I would smell some wines and I would immediately think of my dad's cologne. I, at the time, had no idea what his smell of his cologne was, but I could tell you that wine made me think of his cologne. Another smell that I have a really strong memory with is lilacs. So there are some, on our normal walk, my husband and I take our dog for a walk around the neighborhood. And on our normal walk, there are these bushes that literally look like trees, and they're lilac bushes. And as soon as you turn the corner, you smell it. And I swear to you, as soon as we turned this corner, I was transported back to Dodgeville, Wisconsin. That's where I grew up, and was just immediately back at the first house we ever lived in and was in the backyard, like playing as I was a kid. It's amazing what memories, those smells can bring us back to. So again, there's a good chance a memory might come up, but you might not be able to name it right away. And that's okay. Lean into it. Call the aroma exactly what that memory is, and that's fine. When it comes to smell, it also takes practice. None of us were, taught in kindergarten, here's a blueberry, smell the blueberry, remember the smell of the blueberry, right? You don't have this dictionary of smells ready in your mind. You have to build that. So whenever we're smelling wine, I like to start simple. Now, of course, before we smell, you have to do something very important, and that is swirl your wine. You got to open it up. You got to let oxygen come in contact with that wine. So go ahead and give it a good little swirl. I have a couple videos on Instagram if you want some tips here. But essentially, as long as your wine glass is less than half full, you should feel pretty safe to give it a nice little swirl action here. All right, so now you're going to get your nose in that glass, right? You're going to try to smell lots of different spots. Really get your nose in there. I have accidentally touched my nose to the wine multiple times. So if you do that, you're not alone. All right. And then we're going to start really simple. Does your wine smell like fruit? Simple as that. Okay. And it can be yes or no. Both of those are correct. There's basically no wrong answer when it comes to wine tasting because it's all about your experience. So when you're smelling wine, whatever you smell and whatever you don't smell, that is perfectly fine. Okay, so does it smell like fruit? Let's say if you said yes, what do we do now? Now we need to figure out what kind of fruit. And my favorite way to do this is I pick two fruits that smell very different to me. So if I had a white wine, I might say, okay, lemon. A lemon is nice and tart. It's sour, right? It just has that super freshness to it. All right, so we're thinking lemon. And then on the other side, let's think pineapple, sweet, tropical. It's almost got this like Malibu, right? You're on the beach kind of feel. Okay, so we have those two different smells. Now go back to your wine and tell me which fruit does it smell more like? Now, if you had a red wine, you can do the same thing with, let's say, cherry or plum, right? So cherry to me is definitely more bright. It's got more of that red fruit. And then a plum is just very deep. I think of a pie for some reason whenever I think of plum. So, again, put those in your head and then go back to your wine and tell me which one does it smell more like? And then you're going to keep doing that. Now, on my wine tasting guide that I talked about earlier, that free wine tasting guide that you can download on my website, I have a whole list of aromas. And I highly recommend if you're new at this wine tasting to have that guide in front of you when you're tasting, because looking at a list of aromas and picking from those is a whole heck of a lot easier than trying to get it from your head. All right. We are smart people, but it is hard. So having that list in front of you makes it a lot easier. And then you can sort of just pick different aromas off that list and give your wine a smell and say, does it smell like this? That makes it so much easier than just grabbing something out of thin air. Now, beyond fruit, we can smell a whole lot of other things. And especially if you said, no, my wine does not smell fruity. What do we do then? Now we're going to think about a couple other things. So one, think about your spice cabinet at home. Think about, when you're cooking, what are some spices in there that, really shine? Is there some lavender? Is there some basil? Is there mint? Any of those things. I'm trying to think of other spices. I'm a Wisconsin girl, so one of my favorite spices is cumin, and that's about as far as I go. But for those of you that have a little more spice in your life than me, think about your spice cabinet in any of those. Black pepper is another one that can be fairly common. Now think about, what about your herb garden? All right. So we're going to go back to that mint, that basil, those fresh aromas. Eucalyptus is a common one that we find in Cabernet Sauvignon. And so it really just, the best way to do this to me is to picture that aroma. I know it's weird. You're like, how do you picture an aroma? Think about that aroma in your head. Go to your wine and ask, does it smell like this aroma? And again, you can do an either or here too. So let's say we're going to say, does it smell more like black pepper or does it smell more like mint? Go to your wine, give it a smell. And when we're doing these, one or the other, you have to pick one. You can't say neither. All right. And so for each one, and then you're going to narrow it down more, because maybe you say, you know what? I think it's more mint than black pepper, but not quite mint, right? So then you're going to look in the herb section and think about some other herbs. Could it be eucalyptus or basil? Go back to your wine, see which one it smells more like. There are also different aromas that come from the earth that we can smell in our wine. These are things like vegetables. Green bell pepper is super common. If you've smelled that and been like, holy heck, why does my wine smell like green bell pepper? You're not far off. There's actually a chemical compound in the wine that's also found in green bell pepper. So it's not crazy that you're smelling that. Mushroom is another common one. Different flowers. Now, again, lilac is an aroma that I know in my head, and then I have that one down. But most of the other flowers, I just say floral, or perfumey is another good one. Dirt. I know that sounds crazy, but think about like when you're repotting any house plants or you're outside, digging up weeds, that smell that the dirt gives off, that can be found in your wine. Wet leaves is another one. I like to think about that when, like, if you've ever done a hike in the fall, especially here in Seattle, it's very rainy, but that smell as well. And then there's also one called minerality. If you've ever heard someone say their wine has has this minerality to it and been like, what the heck? Does like rocks smell like something? This aroma to me is that smell that you get when you walk by a waterfall, right? Of the water hitting the rocks. Or if you're in the city, wet pavement, right? I think there's a special name for it, petrichor or something like that. So it is actually a thing. So that smell of the wet pavement, that's what I think of when I think of minerality. And I often find these in a lot of high acid whites like Albarino, Sauvignon Blanc, Chenin Blanc can have it as well. And so next time you have a white wine, give it a smell. See if you get any of that wet rock smell. You can also get different aromas from oak if your wine was in contact with oak barrels of any kind. This can be things like cinnamon, coconut, vanilla, chocolate, coffee. All of those can be found in your wine. And again, when you're smelling your wine glass, just, give it a whiff and think in your head. Pick two different things, do an either or, and figure out which one it smells more like, and then just dive into it. You can't be wrong. This is all based off personal experience, and no one has had the same experience as you. So what you are smelling is correct. All right? Okay, let's move on to step number 3. Now, step number 3 is the best step. It's tasting the wine. However, when you are tasting the wine, I want you to keep something in mind. Most of the flavor of the wine actually comes from the smell, and you can figure this out by just doing a simple experiment. So if you want to try it, go ahead and take a sip of wine while your nose is plugged. It's going to feel weird, trust me, but it's a really fun experience. So plug your nose, take a sip of wine, and wait to unplug your nose until after you swallow the wine. You'll be amazed at how little flavor you get. And the reason for that, most of that flavor is coming from the aromas. It's the same reason as if when you have a cold, you can't taste a lot of food. Like, it all tastes bland. That's because your nose can't work. Now, there is one way to get flavor, some new flavors when you're sipping on your wine. And that's because those little aroma particles that your nose was smelling before, they can travel from your mouth to your nose, that little canal. That's the same reason why you can accidentally squirt milk out your nose. But let's not do that with wine. We just want the aroma particles to travel that way. So one trick that I teach people in order to get a little bit more out of this is after you've had a sip of wine, go for like a medium sip of wine, swallow, and then breathe in through your mouth and out through your nose. And you might get some new flavors that you didn't get when you first smelled the wine. Now, for the most part, though, when we taste our wine, we are determining the structure of the wine, okay? And we're going to talk about that. There are 5 key structural aspects of the wine, and we're going to walk through each one of them. Now, when you take a sip of wine, when you're testing for each of these, I want you to take a medium-sized sip, right? So we're not going for a big gulp, but we're also not doing like little tiny baby sips. Medium-sized sip, get a good amount in your mouth, and then you're going to chew on the wine. Now, you can't see me right now, but I'm putting air quotes around chew because please do not actually bite down. That will hurt your teeth. That is not what we're doing. I don't actually know why it's called chewing on the wine, but it's actually more so swishing the wine. It's like a slow motion mouthwash. You're going to move the wine to either, to different areas in your mouth before you swallow, just to get a good feel for the wine. Okay, so those 5 structural elements in wine. We're going to start with acidity. This is one of my favorite ones, and it's one of the easiest to test for. Acidity is essentially how much does the wine make you like pucker up, like you sucked on a lemon, or in weirder terms, how much does it make you salivate, right? Even just thinking about a sour candy makes you salivate, right? So we're going to think about after you have a sip of wine, how much saliva comes through. And the best way to test this is what I call the drool test. So you're going to take a medium sip of wine. After you swallow, tip your head forward and make sure your mouth is shut. Because the trick is here, if you did not shut your mouth and you would have drooled all over the table, that is a high acidic wine. If you're not getting quite as much, you would have been safe potentially with your mouth open. That's a low acidic wine. Make sense? So give that a try. Let me know what you think. The next structural element is the alcohol in the wine, right? So all of our wine comes at different alcohol levels. In general, they fall between about 9% and 16%, with average being around the 12 to 13% alcohol by volume. And so you can find this number on every label. So this is a cool one that you can kind of like check, like if you're tasting the alcohol. Now, if you thought something was low alcohol and it says 15%, that's not wrong that you tasted low alcohol. A lot of times if the wine is in good balance, you might not notice it. So how do you notice alcohol in your wine? Well, typically it's felt as like a burning sensation. And the best comparison I have here is if you've ever done a shot of tequila, well, that burns all the way down to your stomach, right? Wine should not burn that far down. If it does, please do not drink any more of that wine. That wine has gone very, very bad. Wine, though, will cause a little bit of like a heat or burning sensation towards the back of your mouth, towards the top of your throat. And you might also get a little bit of a tingling on your tongue. And again, alcohol, you can say it's low, medium, or high. And the cool thing is you can always check the label on the bottle because it'll give you that actual percentage. And again, 12 to 13% is probably like where I would say medium hits, maybe 13.5 if we're talking about red wines. And then anything below 12% or is low, and anything higher than 14.5 is going to be high. Yeah, that's alcohol. All right, next one is the body of the wine. Body of the wine is the weight of the wine. How heavy does that wine feel in your mouth? And the comparison I give here, remember when I said I was from Wisconsin earlier? The comparison I give here is milk. And stick with me here, okay? I know this is weird, but a light-bodied wine is best compared to skim milk, where it's just very watery. It's and I don't mean watery in a bad way. I love light-bodied wines, but it doesn't have a whole lot of weight to it. It's very crisp. Okay, and then our medium-bodied wine is like 2% milk. It's got a little bit more weight to it. It's a little heavier, but it's not quite the heaviest. And then finally, we get to our full-bodied wine. This is like our whole milk. This is very viscous. It coats your mouth. You really feel the weight of it. So go ahead and try your wine. Take a medium-sized sip again. Chew on the wine. Move it around different corners of your mouth. And then tell me, is it light, medium, or full bodied. Or you can use my milk scale that is skim 2% and full, or not full, skim 2% and whole milk, right? That's our milk scale for the body, which equates to that light, medium, or full bodied. All right, we're almost there. 2 more structural elements. So the next one is tannin. Tannin is something that is only found in red wine. Well, for the most part, stick with me. I should never say only. There's a lot of rules that are broken in the wine world. It's primarily found in red wine because it comes from the skin of the grapes. And fun fact, most wine grapes, when you press them, their juice is actually clear. So they would all look like white wine if you didn't put the red grapes in contact with their skins. That's where they get the color from. And that's also where they get the tannin. So tannin is what causes a dry sensation in your mouth. So almost like you had cotton balls in there. It's essentially the opposite of acidity. Acidity pulls saliva forward. Tannin pulls it all back. It makes you feel like your gums are sticking to your lips. And if you're curious, if you're still not sure what this sensation is, I learned this trick from a fellow wino. You can hold some red wine, any red wine, put it behind your top lip. So it almost looks like kind of like not chipmunk, but what would that be? Like if you blew up so you're just going to put it behind your top lip and you're just going to hold it there for like 3 seconds. Then after you swallow, you're going to feel that dry sensation. Now, any red wine is going to make it feel like a lot of tannin for that front lip. So this isn't how you figure out if it's low, medium, or high, but this is how you kind of get an idea of what that sensation is. Then when you know how it feels, go ahead and take a regular sip of your wine. So medium-sized sip, chew on it, move it around. Then after you swallow, get an idea of how dry does your mouth feel. And again, this one's best when you're comparing it with other things. You're also going to notice that on your 10th sip versus your first sip is going to feel even more tannic because that tannin builds on each other. All right, makes sense? Tannic wine causes a dry sensation. Last structural element is the sweetness of the wine. So I left this for last because honestly, I think it's one of the hardest things to detect in wine. The thing is, when you're making wine, the fermentation process is where you take yeast and it eats sugar and it produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. So you're taking the sugar and the grape juice and you're converting it to alcohol. Most wines take all of the sugar and convert it to alcohol, and they don't leave any sugar behind. So even if you're getting like a fruity taste and you think it might be sweet, there's a good chance there's actually no sugar in the wine at all. Because our brain seems to think fruit, as soon as we have anything that smells fruity or tastes fruity, must be sweet, because fruit always means sweet. The other thing that can happen is if you ever think of like a really good glass of lemonade, it has a ton of sugar in it, but it doesn't taste overly sweet because you have that acidity of the lemon. Acidity in wine can hide sweetness in the wine. So there might actually be sugar. A common one for this is Riesling. Riesling can be a sweet wine, but it can also be very dry, meaning no sugar at all. However, some of them are exactly in the middle, but you would never know it because the darn acidity of the grape hides the sweetness. So when it comes to sweetness, I don't have any great tips here other than you would really have to do like a whole comparison tasting. And then even then it would still be kind of difficult. So don't worry about it too much. Just kind of have it in the back of your mind to think about. All right. And one bonus structural element, I know I said there were 5 key structural elements. So that was acidity, alcohol, body, tannin, and sweetness. Our bonus one is the finish on the wine. So the finish is basically how long does the good flavor of the wine last after you've finished your sip. If that flavor can last at least 10 seconds, that's considered a long finish on the wine and it's considered a higher quality wine. All right, that is tasting the wine. So we've gone through the first 3 steps. We've looked at our wine, we've smelled the wine, and we've tasted the wine. Now it's time to think about the wine. And now the most important question, did you like the wine? Right? And here I want you to come up with your own rating scale. One of my favorite scales came from, I learned it from the gals on the Wines to Fine podcast. Go check it out. They're wonderful. I have an episode on there where I talk exactly about this stuff. Their scale was 1 through 5. And they said, they would rate a wine a 1 if like they couldn't even finish the glass, right? Like I can't even do this if I'm trying to be polite. Okay. And then a 2 out of 5 is like, all right, I can finish this glass, but like, I'm probably not going to ask for another one. A 3 out of 5 is like, yeah, I'd drink a glass of that and maybe order another one. It's not too bad. I enjoy it. I'd have it at a party or if I saw it at dinner. A 4 out of 5, oh, this is good. I want a bottle of this to take home with me. And then finally, a 5 out of 5, the top level of wines. That means that like you want to have this wine on hand at all times. Like, give me a case that's 12 bottles. I need this now. All right. So feel free, you can borrow their rating scale or come up with your own, but I think it's way more fun to think about it that way than just giving it a 1 through 100 rating, right? That doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Now, you've thought about if you liked it or not. Now I'm going to ask you why or why not. Why did you like it? Why didn't you like it? We just did all this work of figuring out all these different things about the wine, the color, the smells, the acidity level, the tannin. It's like, why do we bother doing all that? For this step right here. Because once you figure out what it is that you like in wine, so if you learn that you like high acidity, you love herbaceous smells, you like the, aromas of lemon, but you prefer to stay away from the tropical flavors, you have become an expert at finding new wines that you're going to love because you can take that information to any wine shop, to any restaurant, and they will help you find a bottle of wine. And we're going to talk more about that on next week's episode. And that's it. You've done the 4 steps of wine tasting, and you now know how to taste wine like a pro. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. If you loved this episode as much as I did, I would love if you could take a quick second to rate it and leave a review. Starting a podcast, this is super important for me to get your feedback and let me know what you think. So I would really appreciate if you could do that for me. I know 2 of the key places you can do this on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts. I think Apple Podcasts has a spot for reviews, and Spotify you can leave a rating. And then don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We're going to be releasing new episodes every Wednesday. And of course, if you know somebody else who loves wine and could benefit from this, please be sure to share it with them. I would really appreciate it. Now, next week is going to be about another important topic. I really loaded up these first few, if you can't tell. We're going to be talking about how to buy wine like a pro. So thanks again for listening. And if you want to learn more about wine, come follow me at Cork and Fizz on Instagram. And to get some practice with these 4 steps, you can sign up for my virtual tasting club, The Cork Crew. And don't forget to use code WINE101 to get your first month absolutely free. Cheers!